Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Ashley Brown. Happy Thursday.
Hello, Scott Osborne. How are you?
I'm excellent. How are you? I'm in upstate New York, I should say, for you and our listeners. So it's pretty nippy. It was 28 degrees this morning, not in sunny Florida.
Oh, no, you are not. So
Yeah.
I'm so excited about today's episode, by the way.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah.
So we're not gonna dilly-dally with chit-chat this morning. We're gonna get right into it. But first, let's recap a little bit what we did last week for folks who might have missed it. I know we had an interesting conversation on the care economy, which is near and dear to your heart.
It is near and dear to my heart. I would encourage anyone who has not had a chance to listen to it yet to maybe take that time. When we talk about some of the barriers to women building economic security, asset building, the care economy just plays a big role in that. And so it was nice to get to spotlight some of the history of it, how we got here, and what are some of our opportunities going forward. And again, the number of women that are impacted in one way or another by the care economy is significant. So, we're
Families, man, everyone who's affected by the care economy. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, and we'll have more conversation to come on that. But I'm glad we finally got it as on the air, because so many things were coming up. And when we think about things happening, lots has happened this week.
Absolutely. And I know you have some good folks in Florida who can talk about upcoming initiatives there. So we'll get back to that hopefully in a few weeks.
Yes.
But I wanted to talk about one thing that happened this week, or it became public since our last show. And I think it's a nice setting the stage for our conversation here today of what we're going to be talking about, is that a abortion provider, actually a midwife, was arrested in Texas, Maria Rojas, and held for, when I last heard, $700,000 in bail for providing abortions. And Texas has been talking about doing this for a while. Attorney General Ken Paxton has made no secret about going after women, and especially attempting to go after women who use abortion pills. So this is a woman who is a midwife. It's interesting. He didn't go after a doctor yet, but needless to say, we don't know what's going to happen in this particular case, but it is of grave concern to not only abortion providers, but people who provide health care to women in all spectrum, because I think there's a great latitude under the Texas law to arrest women, and this is very, very serious charges.
Yeah. Well, and closer to home, we have in the Florida legislature this week a bill talking about fetal personhood for fetuses. It also changes the conversation and the narrative on, I think, punitive damages and just expanding access to continuing to go after people for choice in healthcare. And it's why I'm excited about our guest is it can be such an emotional topic. And I think that's the part of it. And, how do we normalize talking about access and to full reproductive rights versus kind of the emotional blackmail that is part of this conversation.
I agree. So let's move right into it. I think it's important that people understand something that perhaps has been almost forgotten about in the last 50, 60 years, about how foundational reproductive rights are for women to live what I would call a normal 21st century life, to make the choices that they want to make, whatever those choices might be. And that is absolutely foundational to so much else that happens. I think younger women may have forgotten about a time when women could not control their own fertility with any degree of health or safety, and it fundamentally affected everything else in their life: career choices, life choices, choices of partners, marriage or no marriage. It fundamentally affected everything else. So reproductive freedoms, wherever you sit on those things, but freedom to make those choices is so foundational. We had Roe v. Wade, the protections of Roe v. Wade for almost 50 years until the Dobbs decision, as we know, in 2022, left abortion choices up to the states. And so everything now is in a great deal of flux. And currently 41 states have bans on abortion, some very significant, some more moderate, and most of them have to do with what's called gestational duration, which is going to be a lot of the focus of our topic here today.
I know. So I think that we are going to go ahead and welcome our guest. It's our first guest.
It is our first guest. And just by way of background, our guest is Elizabeth Spahn, and she is, I'm going to give a full bio about her, but we really want to talk to her because we want to bring in really factual information about how people see the moment of conception. However, then they apply it into their daily lives. We really want to look at how this has been understood through history. And Elizabeth is a master at that. So let's bring in Elizabeth Spahn.
Okay.
She is we're delighted to say she is now a resident of Manatee County and retired from a long and illustrious career in law. Here's Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well,
Elizabeth, welcome.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, Scott.
Been an advocate for reproductive freedom and equality for more than 50 years, since her undergraduate days as one of the first women in Yale. And she's a professor of law emerita at New England College of Law. Among other cases, she was a plaintiff in the Women v. Connecticut lawsuit seeking access to birth control for unmarried women. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. I know Elizabeth has also written a lot on anti-corruption work. She's traveled and worked around the world, and she's now retired and a resident of Manatee County, which is our gain. And specifically what we want to talk about today is a paper called Misconceptions, the Moment of Conception in Religion, Science, and Law, and how the history in all three of these areas so informs our notion of conception today and informs our law, informs our culture, informs our practices. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Scott. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Hi, Ashley.
hi, Elizabeth. And I am such a fan of yours and so excited you're going to be sharing your voice on this topic. I had the opportunity to hear you speak and of course was not surprised when you and Scott already knew each other and had that connection. So thank you for joining us and sharing your perspective of, I think the first thing is people I feel are going to be surprised at how long this conversation's been happening.
Yes. And I just want to say I'm a huge fan of yours, Ashley. Your work, your leadership on the ground, the grassroots, boots on the ground leadership that you're providing at a Women's Resource Center is just invaluable in these very difficult times. And Scott brings us joy with Through Women's Eyes, the film festival. So it's a real honor to be here with each of you today, much less both of you.
Thank you. So, Elizabeth, let's dive in. I know in your paper you talked about religion and law and science, and today we're really just going to focus on religion as much as possible. And I think just to start us off, I suspect that most people would assume Christian theology has always banned abortion and always had a uniform understanding of conception, but that's not right, correct? Tell us about that.
It's not accurate. It's not accurate. I think most people have fallen for a marketing campaign, in essence, that says Christians have always treasured preborn or unborn life or fetal personhood or moment of conception. There are a lot of different names for it, but the idea that a fertilized egg is a human being under Christian theology and law and science. We're going to talk about theology today. Can I do a law professor disclaimer? I am a law professor. I am not a scholar of religion. So in this law review article, what I did was I relied on real religious scholars, usually from the tradition. So if I'm talking about Catholics, I was relying on Catholic scholars. If I'm talking about Southern Baptists, again, I'm relying on Southern people's description of their own theology.
Absolutely fine. And I will say we are linking your paper in our show notes, and which is amazingly well documented and footnoted. So for folks who want to go back and see the scholars that Elizabeth is quoting, it will all be there in the show notes. So you go right ahead.
I've got more footnotes and Carter's got little liver pills, as we
Go
say in the
there.
Midwest. Yeah, yeah. So the origins of this debate about when does human life begin go back to Aristotle. So the pre-Christian era, the Greek philosophers, Aristotle. So now we're talking about the 4th century prior to the Christian era. So this is BCE, and we're 400 years before. And Aristotle develops a couple of principles, one of which I can't resist talking about, the idea that when does a human soul enter a body and become human, and that principle of ensoulment. And Aristotle's view was that it was male ejaculation that emits the principle of the soul, which would mean, if you followed that view, any type of not female, but male spilling of sperm would
In
be
whatever
murder.
context, in whatever manner, let us say.
However you spill that sperm, it would be murder. So serial killing, mass murder. So this is, the Aristotelian view in the 4th century BCE. And this is, as far as I know, the earliest discussion in Western civilization. I want to have a caveat here. I'm not up to date on Chinese, traditional Asian cultures, Hindu. I'm going to talk Western here. But the other thing that Aristotle did that has become very important, and for 2,200 years provided the dominant framework, is this idea of gradual animation or gradual hominization, becoming a human being, or gradual ensoulment. So I'm going to call it animation because that's an easier word than hominization or ensoulment. But Aristotle's idea, which remained the dominant tradition for 2,200 years, Aristotle said that the soul begins as a vegetative soul. It then becomes an animal soul. This is all during the pregnancy. And finally, very late, then it becomes sufficiently developed to have a human rational soul. And the Greek philosophers were really into rational. So you had to have enough brain formation. It wasn't about a heartbeat. It was about the brain. And so this gradual animation is developed by Aristotle. And this remains throughout Western dominant culture, remains the mainstream view for 2,200 years. There's a minor view with Pythagoras, but it didn't catch on.
So let me see if I get this. So it started with Aristotle that there was this slow development, leaving aside the ejaculation thing for the moment. Once pregnancy begins, there's this slow, as you call it, animation or hominization, which is a progressive thing until at some point in there it's considered human. And that's really related to brain and soul, whatever soul development. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah, and in theology, there's a lot of discussion about what is a soul. Yes, I'm going to stay away from that because it's above my pay grade. But the gradual animation, Scott, is exactly what you're saying, which is it requires a certain amount of development in the fetus or unborn child or preborn, whatever you want to label this stage of the pregnancy.
Before birth.
Before birth.
And then what happened? How did that change?
Well, it didn't change. It didn't change. I mean, we go to St. Augustine, right? Now we're in the early Christian era. So now we're no longer with the pagan Greeks. Now we've got Christians. And St. Augustine, 354 to 430 Christian era. So this is now 700 to 800 years later. And the Christians adopt the Aristotelian view. St. Augustine says gradual animation. It takes a while. Mm-hmm. There's no moment of epiphany. The only people who are having a moment is the male ejaculation. they're having a moment.
Back to the male ejaculation.
That's the moment, is the male ejaculation.
That's
And
the moment.
Aristotle thought that had the principle of the soul. But the rest of us are not having a moment. I mean, we might be having a moment, but there's no ensoulment.
That's another episode.
It is another episode. Yeah. So St. Augustine, the Christians, early Christians, and again, there's this little minority view that doesn't catch on. And then we go to the big guy, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, this is a big saint. This is a huge saint in the Christian tradition. St. Thomas Aquinas, 1259. This is another 800 years. So we've been 800 years from Aristotle to Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
Then we got another 800 from Augustine to St. Thomas. So we've now got 1600 years of gradual animation. And that's the dominant theology, and that's the canon law. And there aren't really criminal laws at that time, but that is the accepted wisdom. And St. Thomas says, delayed animation, delayed hominization. And this is a quote: "The intellectual soul is created by God at the end of human gestation." So that's the Christian view in 1259 to 1274.
Almost as if at birth.
Yeah.
I mean, it almost as if to suggest that at birth end is when it all comes together.
Yeah. I don't know exactly, what months we're talking about, but the end of gestation does not imply a moment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's gradual.
Mm-hmm.
There's no moment, right? And that's where, and there's no focus on fertilized eggs or conception or except for the male ejaculation. But by this time, St. Thomas is not worried about male ejaculation in the same way. So this gradual animation now goes, and it remains through the Spanish Inquisition. We still have gradual animation. The Spanish Inquisition, 1478 to 1834, Spanish Inquisition doesn't change this. Burn the witches, convert the Jews. This was not a pretty event. This is not bragging rights in Christian history. Forced conversions.
Mm-hmm.
1478, the theology, the Christian theology throughout the Spanish Inquisition remains gradual animation, remains with Thomas Aquinas. Again,
before you move forward in history, so can I ask a question about, so up to that time, do we know, or is there a record how, I guess in this case, theologians would have looked at things like miscarriage, for example? Or, I mean, the assumption is that some form of abortion was attempted throughout history. We don't know how, but for example, like something like miscarriage, how would that have been interpreted? Do we know?
We know a surprising amount. Abortions have been occurring since the dawn of time.
Sure.
Since Aristotle's time. Primarily, if I could tell a little personal anecdote here, my mother, God rest her soul, was a church organist in the Presbyterian Church. And she said to me, "Elizabeth, why are you letting men vote on this? It's women's business." And so this is the traditional answer. Men weren't really involved. I mean, it was midwives.
It was done privately in the company of women.
It's privately,
they would figure this out somehow.
Women figure this out.
Okay.
And that's what my mother, the Presbyterian organist, said. She said the men don't have any clue what's going on. And I said, "Mom, we've got the Equal Protection Clause. I can't say men don't get to vote. That's not an option anymore." But that was the traditional view. It was, the men sort of didn't know, you wouldn't have had male midwives, right? It's females. Yep. And this is among the women. And we know often firsthand in our own bodies what's involved in all kinds of miscarriages, abortions. Sure. Maybe your husband's not fertile and you need to produce an heir. and you need to use some in vitro, which isn't so, it's biologically natural. In vitro, artificial insemination. And women have, we've been doing this since the dawn of humanity.
Right.
Long
And just
before
so
Aristotle.
men were not involved, whether by law or practice or theology. It was stuff what women figured out. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. And they wouldn't be viewing this. Now, there is some discussion in the in the Torah, and we probably should get a scholar of Judaism in here, because in the Old Testament, there's a story about two men are fighting and they injure a pregnant woman. And she miscarries. And in this hypothetical in the Torah, and I can get you the chapter and verse. Hold on just a second. It's Exodus 21, 22, 23. So the fetus is not viewed as a person, right? A life for a life is only if the woman dies. So that's the hypothetical in the Old Testament. And that tells you something about this, but it's when a third party injures her, not that she's drinking some tea or whatever. Yeah.
So bring us up. So we're at Thomas Aquinas now. How did we get
the Spanish Inquisition? Right? We're staying with Thomas. Thomas reigns supreme, right? Thomas is the man, and Saint Thomas, and we go through the Spanish Inquisition, and now we get to the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is a big moment for Christians, right? This is a huge, right around 1517, Martin Luther puts the theses up on the door, nails them to the door, and creates the schism in the Western Christian tradition. And I'm going to leave Eastern. I can't do Eastern. I'm sorry. It's a big tradition. It's very important. I just can't do it. So Martin Luther, he knocks the socks off Christianity, right? I mean, he literally splits it. And all of the others. Again, the doctrine of gradual animation doesn't change. It does not change. It's all about the Protestant Reformation is all about corruption, right? Anti-corruption, indulgences.
How could we possibly end up now with the equivalent of heartbeat laws and this? I mean, was there a seminal moment that changed?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So moving right along here, we come to the seminal moment. And this is the year 1869. 18.
Pretty recent, relatively speaking.
Very recent. Yep. 2,200 years later. And it's a Roman Catholic Pope. The Protestants stay with gradual animation, right, until much later, another 120 years. The Roman Catholics have a Pope named Pius IX. And in 1869, he didn't have, usually when there's a big change in Catholic theology, they have a cabinet meeting of all the cardinals, a conclave, and there's committee reports and, debate. None of that happened. Pius woke up one day in 1869 and just announced that 2,200 years of gradual animation theology was wrong. And we're now going to have instant animation. Nestle's coffee, add water, right? It's Folgers. I mean, it's literally instant animation. And he wasn't even very sure about it. What he said was, let me get this quote now. This is a quote now from Pius IX, who wakes up in 1869 and announces, nope, Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, they're all wrong. I don't need a study. I don't need any facts. Sound familiar? I don't need anything. I know. Well, but he didn't know. What he said was, while it may not be known when ensoulment occurs, there was a possibility that it happens at conception.
even though we can't pinpoint conception.
Yeah, there's no moment.
Right.
There
I was
is
going to
no
say
moment.
conception as defined. How did he say? I mean, we've got the whole egg sperm joining thing that we learned about in biology class.
Well, this is 1869, so I don't
Right.
think he had a biology class to go
They
to.
did not have that sense at all. Just
1869, I think.
conception.
Yeah, he just said, well, maybe it happens at conception.
Okay.
So that it would be morally safer to err on the side of protecting ensoulment at conception.
And do we know why he came up with this? Is that like reading
Well,
into the mind of a person?
you know, historical psychoanalysis is tricky.
Okay.
He was raised in a group in the Catholic Church that venerated the Virgin Mary. He was like really into the Virgin Mary. And he was the one, he announced a bunch of other doctrines as well, but with conclaves, with some debate and discussion. One of them was that Mary herself, the Virgin Mary, mother of Jesus, herself was an immaculate conception. Mm-hmm. So a lot of Christians misunderstand that. They think that Jesus was immaculate. No. Jesus had sperm to get conceived, according to Pius IX. It was Mary who was pure and immaculately conceived. Pius IX also did another interesting thing, which you've probably heard about, the doctrine of papal infallibility.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when he speaks ex cathedra, papal, and that he made that one up too. I mean, God spoke to him and told him that he was infallible. But in 1869, when Pius does all this, nobody paid any attention. Okay. I mean, literally, not the Catholics and certainly not the Protestants.
Okay.
And the Jews have their own thing, you know, they're not. So it didn't become canon law until 1917 in the Catholic Church.
Wow.
So let's just pause for a minute here.
Barely 100 years after a couple of thousand years of different understanding.
2,200 years.
Right.
Minimum. I'm erring on the conservative. It could, because we're not sure what was going on before Aristotle.
Sure.
Because a lot of the earlier religions didn't have written documents. The philosophy, you know, we lost a lot. The Romans burned the library at Alexandria. We lost a lot.
But in the last 100 years, there's been quite the acceleration on the shifting of the narrative of conception being the point of discussion for all of these, whether it's the laws, whether it's the judgment, whether, you know, all of the things combined of it's really took hold.
Yes. Yeah, it's been a very interesting kind of 100 years of marketing this idea of instant animation or ensoulment at conception.
Right. And I think, because I know you're coming back with us, Elizabeth, at least twice, I really think that in alone, the reasons of that change in marketing over the last 100 years would be fascinating. And because we just said that for 2,200 years or close there too, men were not really involved, and now we see this total shift. And I know we're going to talk about science in another conversation. I'm sure some of it does relate to the science and the changed understandings of that, and politics writ large, different reasons for men to get involved, even before the last few years, you know, for 100 years there, why that has changed so much.
Yeah, and I really like that framing, Scott. I think that helps a lot. Because I think there's a tendency in modern times to view this as religiously motivated. Mm-hmm. And I think I agree. I mean, I agree with you. This is not primarily a religious issue. It has been motivated by other economic factors, primarily pushing midwives out of the medical business.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that male doctors could have that corner of the market. And we're going to talk about this in a future episode, I think.
Right. No,
But
I
it's
think
not
now
really religion that's pushing the issue, at least at the shift points.
Okay, and I know, Ashley, you're our timekeeper, and I don't know where we are, but I know I read somewhere also that part of it, and this is kind of a religious, but I would call a political religious motivation, that the Catholics were concerned about this once they realized the birth rate and the changing in the birth rate vis-a-vis Protestants. Is that true? So it was kind of like, we have to keep up our numbers issue, literally.
Yeah, it's an arms race. It's a birth rate between the Protestants and the Catholics.
Right.
Well,
right.
And each side wants to have more babies.
and I would contend that, Scott, back to some of our earlier episodes on diversity, equity, and inclusion, where our diversity shifts have happened. I think that that's also been a driver for what kind of babies are being born.
Mhm, mhm.
And I need to point out that during this era, African women who were enslaved were in the United States were bred, involuntarily bred like livestock, to produce a cash crop of slave babies. And not to put too fine a point on this, but the masters would rape the enslaved women because they could sell, and beloved, Toni Morrison. I mean, but the history on this is very clear.
Yeah.
That forced breeding is at the root of what's going on here. And it has fallen, as is often the case, most heavily on enslaved women and poor women.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that
uplifting note.
Yeah, on that uplifting but factual notes, exactly. Okay.
So can I just add about the Southern Baptists? Because they're the ones that are really pushing it right now, the evangelical Christians. I mean, the Catholics are.
We want to sum up.
Okay, so the evangelical Christians, the Southern Baptists, they're not interested. In 1869, they stay with gradual animation. They're not interested in 1917 when the canon law changes. The Southern Baptists get interested in the 1980s.
Wow.
1980s is when the Southern Baptists start to get really active, and it's part of the culture wars. They're pushing back against the liberation of women.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's forced breeding kind of underneath all of this, and they don't even adopt instant animation until their convention in 1999.
Wow.
26 years ago.
Amazing.
So this is where we need to push back with facts, because it is not a majority Christian view. Even Catholics and Baptists, the majority of them favor legalizing abortion in some cases, right? Therapeutic abortions, right? So it is not an absolute Christian doctrine. And the second thing is all the other denominations, all the other major Christian denominations, Episcopalian, United Church of Christ, Evangelical Lutheran Church, United Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church, Unitarian Universalist Church, all allow legal abortion, support legal abortion and you can get into the weeds about when, but it's certainly not instant animation.
Right. So we've had one notion for a couple of thousand years, and then only, which permitted this gradual animation notion, and then only very, very recently, including in some denominations, almost the turn of the 21st century, a latching on to this moment of conception. And now for many, the public perception is that this has always been historical, that abortions have been banned, or that the moment of conception or the heartbeat has been the defining moment of personhood. But what you're saying is that's just not historically by any means true. And it's important because so much of the law and the science, which we'll get into around everything from reproductive rights to fetal personhood to abortion now, hinges so much on this understanding of conception and personhood and heartbeats. So this has been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Really, it is fascinating is the right word, and I think it's illuminating. And that was when I heard you speak, it was just knowing where these conversations began and how long ago they began and when the shift really happened. I think part of what Scott and I are trying to do is to bring fact around topics and not have the bias or emotion involved in discussing it. And this is just a really a great conversation to have and to share. So thank you. And when we look at our next steps, we have many more conversations with you, because how could we can't fit you into a small half hour.
We're going to talk about
small box, do I?
We're going to talk about law again, and then how this has progressed in science. I think it's going to be equally fascinating. And I will say, in our show notes, we have article as well as a couple of more recent discussions of this very topic and some initiatives in Florida. So for those who are listening, those will all be in our show notes, and you can look at the footnotes. And thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for doing this podcast. This is really great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank
care,
you for
Bye.
being here.
Bye-bye.
And Scott, I think that we are over time, so I think we will have to say lots more to come. And
Lots more to come.
lots
Take
of
care.
things in the show
Bye.
notes. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye-bye.